It is a great honor that I introduce the 2020 Percy Julian Award recipient. GSK is a proud sponsor of this award and what it represents, scientific excellence. GSK has been a longtime partner of NOBCChE in developing the next generation of scientists and recognizing the achievements of stellar Black chemists and chemical engineers. Thomas Epps III is the 2020 awardee, and please let me share a little bit about Dr. Epps. He was destined to be a professor as he was born in Virginia to parents who were academic professors. After growing up in Virginia, Dr. Epps left and went to the Northeast to attend college in Boston at MIT, where he obtained both his BS and Masters of Science in Chemical Engineering in 1999. He then moved to the University of Minnesota to obtain his PhD under the supervision of Frank Bates. After completing his PhD research, Dr. Epps joined the NASA Institute of Standards and Technology in the Polymers division. After his stint at NIST, he joined the University of Delaware in 2006 to continue his research in the field of polymers. His research considers the design, synthesis, characterization, and application of nanostructure containing polymers related to biomass materials, drug delivery, alternative energy such as batteries, nanotemplating, and composite-based personal protective equipment. He is currently the Thomas and Keep Gutschell Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering. He has a joint appointment in the Department of Material Science and Engineering. He serves as the director for several research centers, advancing the fields of polymers and material science, with a recent announcement in 2020 as the co-director of the United States Department of Energy Center for Plastics Innovation. He is also an entrepreneur and won the 2019 University of Delaware Fast Pass competition with his spin-off company that focuses on making sustainable materials from renewable biomass. Dr. Epps is the recipient of many awards, such as the 2016 American Physical Society John H. Dillon Medal and the 2015 American Institute of Chemical Engineering's Owens Corning Young Investigator Award. He is an elected fellow of both the Royal Society of Chemistry and the American Physical Society. This year, he was highlighted by the American Chemical Society as a prominent African-American chemist. Without further ado, please enjoy the lecture by Dr. Thomas Epps III.
Good morning. I'd like to start out by saying that I am deeply honored to be the recipient of the Percy L. Julian Award. And I thought I'd start out before getting into my talk just by mentioning a NOVA video on Percy Julian called The Forgotten Genius. One of the reasons that I mention this is because I was actually very fortunate and lucky to actually be the MC of the ceremonies when this video was pre-screened and first shown by NOVA in collaboration with the American Chemical Society in 2007. I was a bit younger back then. It was actually a time when I didn't have hair as opposed to now, but it's very nice to actually win an award for someone who had such a distinguished career and such an impact on science and humanity in general. So one of the things I like to do is tell you a little bit about our work and some of the things that we've been doing looking at materials from biomass waste and trying to turn, again, natural products, just like Dr. Julian, in this case, biomass waste to high-performance polymers. And the way that I'd like to get started in that is to tell you a little bit about two stories. The first is about how we can take depolymerized natural products, so in this case, biomass, and actually use it to make self-assembling materials. In particular, I'm going to talk about some model studies as well as in some real materials. And in the second part of the talk, I'm actually going to switch from self-assembling materials to materials such as BPA, and how we can generate enhanced performance and reduced environmental impacts by using bio-based feedstocks. So the first thing that I'll mention is that a lot of what we're doing is a part of a materials lifecycle management program that we have that's focused on sustainability, where we're very interested in 4 different aspects. So the engineering aspect, so when we think about the chemical engineering, how do we scale up, how do we do various aspects of the process, our feedstocks and our sources in terms of geosciences, our toxicity and enzyme engineering in terms of biological sciences, And what I'll focus more on today is sort of our chemistry and material science and engineering type work, where we actually look at the polymer systems and try to understand some of the structure property relationships so that we can help design new materials that can complete this life cycle management circle. So one of our ultimate goals, as I'll get into, but I'll tell you a little bit of the punchline, is we're really interested in, can we take materials such as these trees, or feedstock such as these trees? Right now they're turned into paper, some fine chemicals, fuels, and some plastics. But one of the major components that I'll talk about is the lignin, which is typically burned. And approximately 250 Empire State Buildings a year of lignin are burned. And so our goal here is, can we start using some of this material for other applications, such as maybe designer tennis shoes, high performance dental resins, and other types of material to really valorize that biomass. So we want to do that, but we recognize that there's several challenges in bio-based materials, and we want to think about how can we actually then overcome these challenges. I mentioned 5 on the slide, so feedstock abundance, chemistries, in the sense that we want to be able to make bio-based materials, but we want to have readily scalable, relatively straightforward chemistries. We want to think about chemical toxicity, because even though we're going to be dealing with primarily natural products, there is still some potential chemical toxicity in these materials. And then 2 of the main things that we want to consider are properties and cost. So do we have materials that perform better than, say, petroleum-based benchmarks? And can we think about ways that they will either cost the same or, even better, cost less than their petroleum analogs? And I'll give a brief introduction to block copolymers, because we'd like to do this in high performance materials, meaning that we can get hierarchical and self-assembling type structures. So when we first think about block copolymers, what do we mean? Essentially what we mean is we've taken 2 homopolymers, say shown as A and B. You can think of that as something like a polystyrene, a more brittle material, a polyisoprene, a rubbery material, and we can chemically connect them together. Now, if we do that, they're chemically distinct, so they will want to phase separate, but because they're chemically connected, they're going to phase separate on the nanoscale. And in this particular case, we can get that separation to be on the order of single to tens of nanometers, meaning that we get phase separation on the order of 1,000th the width of a human hair. Why is this important? Because now we can get the best of both worlds in terms of properties. So we can get things that hold their shape yet are impact resistant, or things that hold their shape yet are also ion conductive or allow facile separations. Now we start thinking about block copolymers. How do we make them in practice? Well, we use something called chain growth polymerization. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the polymerization mechanism itself, but I just want to point out a couple key features. When we think about chain growth polymerization, it allows us to get a controlled molecular weight, a homogeneous chain distribution, and a narrow chain length distribution as well. Why do we want those things? Because that allows us to get reproducible self-assembly, reproducible materials, and actually allows us to really fine-tune the performance of various systems. So how does this work? When we think about that block copolymer synthesis, we can think about monomer A, which is forming together in a chain. We can then add monomer B to make a second block. We could add monomer C. We could go on to D and so on. But the key point is that we can make these well-defined block copolymers that will phase separate on the nanoscale. And as I mentioned, we can do this in a variety of forms. So I'm just showing here an AB where we have red, blue, an ABA where we have red, blue, red. The key points are that we can take these materials. If that red block is a glassy block like polystyrene, then we can take that, stretch it, our material will stretch, and then we release it and it comes back to its original shape. And one of the best analogies for that is something like a rubber band. Now, one of the things that you can see implicitly in this sketch, but is shown down here on the left, is that these materials have actually self-assembled, in this case into a spherical nanostructure, and we want to be able to control that so that we can get some nice properties. And what are the applications? So again, I mentioned things like rubber bands, car tires, shoe soles, packaging, and other sorts of impact-resistant materials, O-rings, gaskets, etc. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm actually going to focus on things that we're looking at as potential alternatives to polystyrene. And so when we look at that, we look at styrene, produced at in excess of 25 million tons a year, has a glass transition temperature of about 100 degrees Celsius and a degradation temperature right around 200 or above 200 degrees. Why do we care about these two things? Well, the glass transition temperature is analogous in some instances to the use temperature of the material. And if you think about this, you're all familiar with it in terms of a styrofoam cup that I fill with boiling water and it starts to get soft. Right at about 100 degrees is that softening, or in this case, we can call it a glass transition temperature for that polystyrene. In terms of degradation temperature, if we want to be able to melt process our material, we need a substantial region between that glass transition or softening like temperature and that degradation temperature to provide a nice window for the processing. Now, some of the things that we want to take advantage of are that styrene and polystyrene are petroleum-based. Our materials are going to be bio-based. And styrene is a toxic and volatile monomer. So if we can design monomers that are less toxic and less volatile, that also gives us a potential advantage. So as I mentioned, I'm going to now go a little bit into the bio-based and self-assembling polymers that we've been studying a bit in our lab. So as 2 slides is a bit of a brief background, we're not the first people, obviously, to do bio-based polymers, and this slide actually shows some of the potential promise as well as some of the current pitfalls. So if we look again at polystyrene, we're also doing a lot of work with low glass transition materials such as polyisoprene. I'm not going to focus on that in this particular talk, but there is definitely ongoing work in that area. What I will focus on is, for example, polylactide is one of the more famous synthetic versions of bio-based polymers. In this particular case, it has demonstrated some very nice commercial potential. However, one of the concerns, if I'm going to use that, for example, with my hot coffee or hot tea, is that glass transition temperature of about 60 degrees Celsius is really going to prevent use in those applications. I can obviously then switch to something like polyalpha-methylene gamma-butyrolactone, glass transition temperature of 195. So you might say, well, that's great. That's well above the temperature of boiling water. But one of the challenges there is that now I have to heat this material well above 200 degrees C in order to melt process that. So that's added energy input in order to make a material. Now, in addition to these things, I've actually zoomed in on the arrows. And the reasons that I've done that is because now you can see that, for example, polylactide can be made from corn, competition with the food supply. In terms of, say, alpha-methylene gamma-butyrolactone, I can get that from things like tulips. But if I look over here, if I'm thinking about the scale of polystyrene production, I'm thinking about 24 million tons a year. I can get alpha-methylene gamma-butyrolactone in about a 1% yield from tulips, meaning that I'm looking at growing of the order of 2 billion tons of tulips in order to meet the similar demands of polystyrene. So basically, there needs to be a better option that allows us to match that sustainable scale-up potential without competing with food supplies or otherwise further harming the environment. So in our particular case, we decided to use lignin as a feedstock. One of the reasons for that is because if you look at current pulp and paper mills as well as biorefineries, lignin is essentially a waste product of that process. So I can take the cellulose and hemicellulose, as I described earlier, use that for a variety of things. But the lignin is essentially burned for energy recovery or either thrown away in the landfill. And our goal here is, can we actually use that to make commercially viable products? Why do we want to do this? Because if I think about the economic viability of biorefineries, one of the key challenges is if I'm taking about 15 to 25% of my starting material and throwing it away right off the bat, that doesn't really help the economics of my process. So why lignin? Well, the first thing is there's about 70 million tons a year of lignin produced as a waste product. Only 2% of that is actually used as a chemical feedstock. Furthermore, most of the lignin does not consume any food resources, and I can get it easily from trees. And as I mentioned, it's actually trees that have already been used for another process. So we're not necessarily even necessitating the cutting down of trees to supply, for example, that 70 million tons of waste. Now, one of the things that I'll get into in a little bit more detail later on is that I can think about different types, such as softwoods and hardwoods, and I can get different components, such as these methoxyphenols, where I have one methoxy group. I can think of phenols with no methoxy groups, or dimethoxyphenols as two methoxy groups. One way to think of that in a little bit more tangible terms is if I think of a softwood like a pine tree swaying in the breeze, you can imagine the type of properties I might get from that, as opposed to an oak tree, which is going to be quite steady in the wind. So we can use that sort of intuition and also then combine it with our characterization tools that I will show in a minute to help us design some new polymeric materials. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a couple model studies that we've been focused on. And what we're going to do is we can take wood. I'm going to actually not do the catalysis justice. We've been doing a lot of work on catalysis, both in my group and with some of our collaborators, primarily Dion Vlachos at the University of Delaware. But one of the key things is that these are some of the major compounds that can come out of a catalytic depolymerization of a biomass. And so what we can do is we can take these, for any of you that are familiar with chain growth polymerization that I talked about earlier, there are no real functional handles that lead to chain growth polymerization in these molecules. So what I can do is I can do a quick one-step, relatively straightforward, easy, relatively low cost functionalization to get these acrylate or methacrylate handles shown here that then I can use as basis for my polymerization to generate the molecule shown at the bottom. So now I can actually make methacrylate-based or acrylate-based chain growth polymers that I can use for further study. So the first thing that we did is we took the individual molecules that were on the previous slide, homopolymerized them. So we have structures shown here where the R groups are basically things like a vanillin, so an aldehyde group, a methyl group, an ethyl group, and so on. We can do differential scanning calorimetry. The curves are shifted vertically for clarity, but the key point here is shown in the rightmost column. And that's basically that once we polymerize these materials, we can see that we have glass transition temperatures at 100 degrees or even slightly above. Now that's quite nice because not only does that match up with what we need for polystyrene, but that also means that, you know, what if I had my creosol methacrylate cup, for example, instead of my styrofoam cup? I could now actually boil my water for my tea in the cup that I wanted to use to actually make that tea. We could also then think about using these materials, say a vanillin methacrylate for low pressure steam type applications as well, and replace some of those materials in various systems. Now that's nice. Do we have the thermal stability? And the answer is yes. I won't focus too much on the TGA or thermogravimetric analysis data here. I will just mention that our onsets of degradation are all well above 200 degrees Celsius. I should also point out that we do these experiments in air as opposed to nitrogen. And one of the reasons that we do that is so that we can better mimic the processing conditions that you might see in a commercial production type setting, which is in air as opposed to an inert environment. So that's quite nice. Now, one of the interesting things that we then found was basically the following. So all the DSC data, the calorimetry data that I showed, was these materials that I'm circling down here. They were all monomethoxy substituents. Now, if we were able to take, in this case, say an oak tree and do that depolymerization, what we then end up with is dimethoxy substituents. And one of the things you'll notice, and notice the break in the y-axis, is now we get glass transition temperatures up to and above 200 degrees Celsius. That's quite nice because basically we're starting to reach high performance polymer territory, and we're getting all this from a waste product from a pulp and paper refinery, pulp and paper processor, or a biorefinery. The other thing that I'll point out, because I'll mention this again in the next slide or two, is that they're both methacrylate functionalities, meaning that we should be able to co-polymerize to basically target any glass transition temperature in this range and tune it for various applications. Now, one of the nice parts about that is that we can actually make those copolymers, and then so we can do some really neat studies. So one in particular was this, where we were able to take craft pine lignin, and we were able to think about it in the following way. In collaboration with Mike Klein, formerly University of Delaware in chemical engineering, he actually did some computational catalysis studies on the depolymerization of craft pine lignin. When he did those studies, what he was able to come up with is under two different depolymerization conditions, these are the compositions of feedstocks that we could expect to come out of that process. What we could then do, because we have homopolymer data shown here for each of the polymers and the expected compositions, we could then calculate the glass transition temperature of a polymer if we were to mix these feedstocks together. And so those two examples, A and B, are shown here with the predictions in the open triangles. Now what we could do is we could actually do that depolymerization process, clean up our resulting product, functionalize it, polymerize it, and then analyze it via differential scanning calorimetry, or DSC. When we did that, we actually got the solid triangle shown here. So one of the nice things is we got really nice agreement between our predictions and our measured data. I will say that this is some of our best case data, though our worst case data seems to be off by no more than 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, which is still really good when we're thinking about application potential and predicted application potential. So now that's quite nice, but one of the key things is that I mentioned is, can we actually then take these materials and make nanostructured block copolymers? And so the answer is yes. We actually, in this case, used a raft polymerization, so a controlled radical or pseudo-living radical type polymerization. We took vanillin as our lignin-based component, methacrylated that, and then we actually made a block copolymer of that with lauryl methacrylate, so basically something I could obtain from used cooking oil. Got a relatively well-defined polymer, and then we can image that polymer and analyze it. So in this particular case, we could do TEM, or transmission electron microscopy, look at the different types of nanostructures that were formed. And if you remember, one of the things that we're interested in was spheres of a hard material, so that lignin-based methacrylate shown as the dark dots, in a matrix of a soft material, such as the lauryl methacrylate, which is shown in the light due to staining. And so what that then leads to is a nice, very tacky material that we've been able to publish and patent, and we have several licensing opportunities that we're actually pursuing with this material because it has properties very similar to the adhesives that you would find on the back of sticky notes. Now, I will mention the pink color here. This pink color is actually just the chain transfer agent that's in the polymer, and we can burn that off at 80 degrees to make a nice clear sample or a white powder. but we left the color in here just primarily for artistic license so that it made for a bit better visual. Now, those are some things we can do from model or heavily separated lignin. One of the things that we can also do is actually use real biomass and make pressure sensitive adhesives. So in this particular case, we can take biomass. Poplar wood was our example that I'll use for the next several slides. We can take that poplar wood, grind it up in something like a relatively inexpensive coffee burr grinder, depolymerize it using a catalytic depolymerization. In this case, we use ruthenium on carbon. We can get our precursors out, functionalize them to make monomers, make block copolymers, and then fabricate pressure sensitive adhesives and look at their performance. So one of the things that I want to point out, and I'm happy to discuss a bit in the question and answer period, is that when we do this depolymerization, we're actually doing a catalytic depolymerization as opposed to pyrolysis. Some of the advantages of that catalytic depolymerization are we can do things at lower temperatures, and that depolymerization is more selective. So instead of getting about the 50 or 60 products that you might get from pyrolysis, we get a relatively small number of products from that catalytic depolymerization. I'll show one of the other advantages later on in terms of color and odor, but for now, suffice to say that this is the GC of the products that we get out from that depolymerization. Now, we did need to do a separation, primarily because we want to make linear polymers. And for those of you who know about polymers, if we start functioning hydroxyl groups here, with our methacrylates, if I functionalize 2, I'm going to start getting branched materials. So I'd really like to have just these monofunctional materials that I'm circling right now. So how do we do that? We did one separation step. And that one separation step was liquid-liquid extraction. We can use hexane and water, a little bit of methanol in some cases. And we actually then end up with a GC that looks something like this. And so this is quite nice because what you can see is that we now have just our 2 primary products. No column chromatography or other separation approaches are needed. We can take these materials, we can functionalize them, and we can do a couple things. So these are the 2 major components. We can take them, use them as the mixtures. That's what I'll do on the next 2 slides. We can also take them, if we need to, separate them into their individual components so that we can measure the properties of these new propyl-guaiacol, propyl-syringol acrylates and methacrylates that we can produce. But anyhow, I'm going to spend 2 quick slides just telling you about some of the promise of these materials, in particular for commercial PSAs or pressure-sensitive adhesives. So what we could do is we could take that mixture of the 2 components, functionalize it, polymerize it, and then cast it onto a polyethylene backing and look at it as a pressure-sensitive adhesive. I'm going to show you about 2 of the 4 ASTM standard tests that we did. So the 180-degree peel test, where we can take it, we can look at it on glass slide or stainless steel, and essentially measure that peel force. Now, one of the things that might be a little bit hard to see, but I do want to point out, is that using this lignin and the catalytic depolymerization, we actually are able to remove a lot of the color from these components. And as you can see, our tape is essentially clear. It's not brown or black like you might expect for a native lignin species or even a pyrolysis type oil. Now, more importantly, in terms of performance, if you look at the peel forces of our materials, you can see our material here. MBM is typically the base polymer that can be used for adhesives such as Scotch tape or Fisher brand labeling tape. And the way one gets from basically this point up to here is to add some tackifiers and additives. One of the nice things about our material is that we're actually able to achieve these high peel forces with 100% block copolymer, no tackifiers or additives, meaning that we have simpler manufacturing as well as a longer shelf life because we don't have evaporation and other considerations. Now, that's only one test. We can also do other tests, such as the loop tack test. So in this particular case, I'm basically taking a piece of tape, folding it over, and looking at the force to pull it off of, again, a substrate, so glass or stainless steel. And again, what you can see is our materials are very competitive with Scotch tape and Fisher brand labeling tape. One of the nice things as well is that we can put in additives to actually bring this bar up higher to meet that labeling tape, or even add some things that can reduce that peel force to be more on the order of a Scotch tape type material. So that's quite nice, and that's what we can do with poplar wood. One of the things that I want to just briefly mention is that when I start thinking about biomass, there's obviously a diversity in the biomass and diversity in that biomass composition. So if we think about things like switchgrass, poplar wood, or corn stover, we can actually think about the following. If we have information on those S to G ratios, so the syringols to guaiacol ratios, for say switchgrass, for poplar wood, which is more of a hardwood, for corn stover, then what we can do is, by knowing the compositions and again using some basic polymer physics, is that we can actually predict the glass transition temperatures of polymers made from switchgrass, poplar wood, and corn stover, either when they're methacrylated or acrylated. Now, the nice part about this, and I don't show the data in the interest of time, but at most we're within, or we're not outside of 5 degrees when we actually made real samples and tested them from these different feedstocks. So now not only do we have the ability to make and design these materials, but we have ability to predict things like some of their thermal properties, and we're actually working on predicting some mechanical and flow properties like zero shear viscosity and storage modulus and a few other things for these particular systems. Now, just as a quick summary before I spend the last few minutes on the next part, is that we're actually then able to now show that we can use lignin, sustainable low-cost feedstock, has very nice and widely tunable thermal properties and flow properties, and predictable behavior, which is important for a biomass feedstock. But more importantly, we have this versatile library of monomers that we can use to make block copolymers and other types of systems. Now, one of the things that we can do, and that we have done, is we've actually started looking at the commercial potential. We have a company called Lignolics, where we're really interested in unlocking the value of lignin. I'm not going to talk too much about the company, just mention that we have a nice team of people, both in polymers and catalysis at the University of Delaware. And also mention that what we're interested in is not just using wood, but using food waste and agricultural residues in our catalytic processes to make adhesives, coatings, additives, and basically working and partnering with biomass suppliers, as well as contract or in-component manufacturers. And just to date, we've had a little bit of success, but we're still quite early on in the process. Now, in the last couple minutes, what I want to tell you about is some of the alternatives to BPA, or bisphenol A, that we've been able to make from lignin. Now, when we look at these particular systems, some of the things that we've been interested in, and I've talked about, are sort of things like polystyrene. We're also interested in replacements to polycarbonate, and so that's a BPA-based material, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. We're also interested in making alternatives to PET, but I won't focus too much on that particular material. So what are the advantages of these materials? So they impart some nice rigidity, and they also are materials, they're also materials that have high glass transition temperatures and can be made from cheap monomers. So what are some of the disadvantages of these particular systems? So they're petroleum derived, and they have some known health impacts. And what are potential applications when we think about these materials? So things like dental resins, things like bottles. We talked about the styrofoam cups, the Nalgene bottles, your computers, and then even some more expensive luxury items like, for example, a yacht. Now, when we specifically mention BPA, what are some of the considerations? So you can see that there's a relatively large global market for BPA. But there were some huge or enormous health considerations associated with it. So much so that it was banned in many products, in particular in baby products and food contact materials in 2012. One of the challenges and unfortunate challenges is that there have been a large growth in BPA-free plastics. But one of the challenges is that these materials, in many cases, haven't been tested as stringently for their estrogen activity. So while they're BPA free, there's become increasing evidence that these materials actually still leach compounds that are just as endocrine disrupting, and in some cases more endocrine disrupting than the BPA based materials that they're designed to replace. So in our particular case, we said, can we use some of the same feedstocks that we talked about previously? And so just as one example of how we thought about doing that, so at the top, I'm showing the industrial synthesis route, or one of the industrial synthesis routes to BPA. In the bottom, I'm showing our molecule, which is BGF, so bisguaiacol F. Again, and this molecule can be made from vinyl alcohol and guaiacol, two of the products from the lignin depolymerization process. The thing I want to point out is that we're going to use the same solid acid catalyst, same temperature, same environment, and same time, so that these materials really become much like a drop-in replacement to BPA in terms of designing, for example, a polycarbonate. Now we can take these materials, I won't focus too much on all the details of this slide, but just purely I want to point out that the two commercial materials, so Badge, the BPA derived version, and BGF, DGE, which is the analog to BPA that does not have the two methyl groups on the bridge. If we look at those materials and compare them to our bio-based analogs, what we can see is similar glass transition temperatures, similar moduli, at 30 degrees C of about 2 to 3 gigapascals, and similar moduli at elevated temperatures at 200 degrees C of about 40 or so megapascals. So in terms of mechanical and thermal properties, they actually hit the mark, but we wanted to look at their toxicity as well. So we can take BPA using the EPA's EpiSuite tool. We can actually begin to predict some of the toxicities of our materials relative to BPA. And so we can see that our materials, for example, have much higher LC50s, EC50s, essentially a higher number indicates that they're a bit safer, as well as they have much lower octanol to water partition coefficients, meaning that they won't accumulate in the, say, for example, the fatty tissue of fish and other sorts of animals in the marine or aquatic environment. Now, this is nice, but this is basically just an estimation routine from the EPA. So we actually worked with one of our collaborators, Dr. Cheng-King Wu, or Professor Cheng-King Wu, in animal and food sciences at the University of Delaware. And we're actually able to assess the estrogen activity of our materials using estradiol as a positive control along with BPA, and then testing some of our BGF type materials. So this is a busy slide. We don't need to focus on the entire thing, but I just want to mention a couple key features. So Professor Wu did this using two tests. One is an MCF7, so a breast cancer cell proliferation assay, and the other one's a transactivation test. Basically, the way to read this chart is that anything above 0 indicates estrogen activity, and anything below 0 is essentially can be read as a 0 value or non-estrogen active. So now if we look at these, you can see the estradiol, and you can see the BPA shown in the red bars. Now you can see our materials. Some of the nice things is that all of our bars are typically lower than those of the BPA. I want to highlight a couple key concentrations. So the first thing you can see at very high concentrations, many of our materials are much lower. You can see BGF1 here is quite a bit higher, and we've actually been able to develop some additional structure property relationships that look at isomer content, and we can use that to determine why this material is slightly higher. Anyhow, this concentration is not necessarily always the most relevant, because this would be a concentration, say, for example, if you had eaten a Nalgene bottle. This is the type of concentration that you would see more likely in an everyday situation. And you can see that many of our materials are actually completely non-endocrine disruptive. So we can start to develop some nice structure property and structure activity relationships. And where are we going from that? Is we can take these materials and now start making other things. So in addition to thinking about, say, polycarbonate type materials, we can also make things like 3D printed materials from diacrylates, dimethacrylates, curable epoxy type networks, ureas, amines, and other sorts of materials that I can use from everything from bulletproof glass, the energy responsive shoe soles of running shoes, skis, food contact materials, and plastic containers. So as last, the only thing I want to point out is that we're really interested in sustainable polymers. I've talked mostly about the polymer aspects, but we also have done extensive techno-economic analysis to look at the costs of these materials, looked at the health impacts, and then looked also at basically our feedstock sources, how we can improve the sources, and how we can begin to predict some of the polymer properties based on the source of our raw materials. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. We did want to do a couple acknowledgements. So in particular, Professor Richard Wohl, who unfortunately has passed away several years ago, but he was one of the inspirations for our initial work. Some of the people from my group, from Joe Stanzione, one of our collaborators at Rowan University. The catalysis, we do quite a bit of it in my lab now, but we learned a lot from Professor Dion Vlachos at the University of Delaware, as well as Basu Saha, and Lee, who's now a professor at Virginia Tech. Chris Cloxon, and then I mentioned Professor Chang-King Wu from Animal and Food Sciences. We've been fortunate to have a lot of efforts funding our work, and there's some examples. And with that, I'd like to take any questions that we might have during the Q&A period. So thank you very much. And thank you again. I'm very honored to have received the Percy Julian Award.